The Battle of Soui changed my life and changed my attitude. And I'm glad I didn't live as the person I was before the battle, because it gave me a new perspective on life after the battle. On the landing, where we assaulted the landing zone on the 19th, we lost 6 helicopters and 28 men. And then, that was the 19th of March. On the 21st of March, we were attacked by in excess of 6,000 North Vietnamese and hardcore Viet Cong, and we were 450. And you can imagine what kind of a battle that was.
Sure.
It was a survival battle. We were overrun a couple of times, and an ugly day.
Something you wrote, you said that you buried your war experiences for decades. You said that you worked hard with the idea that if you ended each day exhausted, then that wouldn't leave energy to think about your time in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And you said that among the reasons you did this, in addition to the hardships of battle and the memories of battle and all of that, that another reason you worked to suppress your memories of Vietnam and not talk about them was, as you wrote, because our society at the time was very cruel to us. And I'm wondering what's behind that statement. What did you mean by that statement? That idea that society was cruel to Vietnam veterans?
Well, let me start that by telling you about the incident that happened in July of 1968 when I returned from Vietnam. I landed at Travis Air Force Base in California, a little north of the Bay Area, and they bussed us into Oakland, California, to the Oakland Army Terminal, where they then would give you a little orientation and release you to bus stations, train stations, airports, and the like. As we left Travis Air Force Base, we went out the back gate. There were no less than 200 protesters with signs, baby killers, murderers, and whatnot. They were throwing tomatoes and eggs and whatnot at the buses as we came out of Travis Air Force Base. That in itself was disheartening. As we got to Oakland Army Terminal, the orientation was, if you have civilian clothes, change your clothes and travel home in civilian clothes, and we'll ship your duffel bag to your home.
Wow.
So that you reduce the chance of being accosted along the way. I lived just outside of Oakland, so for me, I had a family member come pick me up and drive me home. And during that period of time, as I'm on leave, I'm just back from the war. I've spent 20 months, in a terrible environment. Just a way to put a cap over the top of that.
Sure.
And as I was, I'm 23 years old, and so I've got a little 1959 Corvette, a little red Corvette. And I start, going out, hanging out at the places that my schoolmates and, friends and whatnot would hang out at the bars and, music and all that kind of stuff. A lot of my high school friends would not talk to me. It is not easy to kill people. It is an emotional, it tears at the fabric of whatever humanity you have.
When did you volunteer to go to Vietnam?
In the summer of 1966.
Summer of 66. And when did you actually arrive?
I arrived in Vietnam in December of 66.
And what was your first impression of the country upon arrival?
Well, getting off the airplane, a wave of hot, moist, stagnant air.
Yeah.
Overwhelming,
And where did you arrive?
Plane and I landed at Benoit Air Base
Benoit.
and was sent to Long Bin, where they had a replacement battalion. And immediately, you know, you're starting to, the smells and the, I'd never having been anywhere in the tropics except Hawaii. You know, it was an overwhelming sense. And of course, the details while you're waiting for your movement to whatever unit you're going to be assigned to, you do these little details. And of course, some of the things that not a lot of people would talk about, latrines, for instance, get crapped in sections of 55-gallon barrels, you know, like in an outhouse. And then they take and they,
right.
When they dispose of that, they take these barrels out and they fill them full of diesel oil and put some paper or whatever in there and light them on fire. And you got to stir them so that they all burn, you know.
And did you have this duty?
Yeah, I had to take a detail. You know, I was a sergeant, so
Okay.
you know, I had to take a bunch of young men out, and actually, we got sent up to the women's replacement barracks to do that.
What was your job in Vietnam? Early on, you're sergeant supervising privates as they're burning up all of the crap in the 55-gallon barrels. But what is your, you know, as you're projecting ahead, what are you going to be doing in Vietnam?
Well, my actual MOS, your military job description.
Sure.
I was a mortar crew. I was the fire direction control chief.
Fire direction control.
But as I got to Vietnam, and this is a total unit of drafted people, I'd been in the Army 4.5 years.
Yeah.
So I was not only the senior member of my platoon, but I was an equal rank to some of the younger members who had been advanced up because they didn't have anybody. And so there was a little animosity underlying, you know, under the surface. I was a new guy. These guys have all been together for about a year. Training, 30 days on a ship, you know, 2 months in Vietnam, and I'm a new guy. So all new guys, whether you're a private or a sergeant, are all put in the same category.
Yeah.
You're what we call the FNGs.
Right. Yeah.
And so they treat you that way. And because they had all this camaraderie, cohesion, you're an outsider. And you never really get to be an insider.
Even after combat?
It doesn't make any difference. You know, I was never an insider with that group. Wow. Because they got drafted together. I was an enlisted guy. You know, I volunteered. You know, they all got ripped out of their lives and sent to Vietnam against their choice. So as this time, they had a little conflict there. I actually was the platoon sergeant, but they didn't want to, as a mortar platoon, we never took our mortars anywhere because they were too heavy.
Right. And
so we were actually just another infantry platoon.
I see.
And so that day at on March the 19th, as we assaulted what we call landing zone gold, we were taking our mortars this time. But, you know, when you're assaulting an LZ, you're not going to set your mortars up and start firing them because you don't know where anything is. And you're just trying to secure whatever the landing zone is that you're trying. It's an objective you're trying to make sure that you take and control. And so on the landing, like I said, we lost a number of helicopters. I got blown out of the helicopter on the landing. One of the helicopters just to my front, on the right-hand side, they come in and you got 10 helicopters coming in on each flight, and the LZs are not that long, so you're kind of at parallel two columns and staggered. So 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, in that kind of a ladder.
Sure.
And two of the helicopters on my 10 ship landing got hit with buried, unexploded, either aerial bombs or artillery rounds. And each helicopter has 11 men aboard, 2 pilots, 2 door gunners, and 7 combat troops. And both of those helicopters were destroyed and everybody died.
Wow.
And so that in itself, when you're, and I was sitting on the floor of the helicopter with my feet on the skids as we were coming in. We were only maybe still between 10 and 18 feet up or thereabouts. It's kind of hard to judge the distance because the downwash is throwing a lot of dust and the like.
Right.
And I got the concussion of the helicopter blowing up to my right and front, kind of blew me out the door.
Wow.
And I was kind of maybe a little bit in shock because, you know, if you jump from that distance, at least you have some control over yourself. But when you get blown out unexpectedly, you know, you're going to hit whatever fashion you hit. And it was kind of like a 3-point landing. My head, my knees, you know, and you got all this gear on your back. And you got a rifle and you know, you probably got 70 pounds worth of stuff. Wow. On your body. So, and a steel helmet, it wrenched my neck, hurt my knee, busted me up a little bit, but
so you were blown out of the helicopter you were on by the explosion of the other helicopter that was hit?
Yeah.
Wow. Now this is March 1967?
Yeah. About 10 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts, 11 o'clock.
Had you experienced combat before this time?
Yeah, a few firefights, you know, smaller things. We hadn't made any, we'd made a number of helicopter landings, but there's always that differentiation between what's expected to be a hot LZ as opposed to an uncontested LZ. Where you're just planning a landing into an area that might already be secured by other units.
Yeah.
And this one was, you're going into a completely unknown environment. You don't know what's there. You might have prepped it with some artillery, but you know, the enemy is going to hide. They're going to wait until after you've made a landing before they attack you, if they're going to attack you. And so there were a lot of snipers and there was no major enemy unit there attacking us.
Mm.
But you were under mortar attack and rocket attack and snipers, and so you're not thinking about, you know, okay, I'm feeling a little bit like I was just hit by about 3 linebackers in a football game, you know. And
so what happens next? You're blown out of the helo 10, 12, 15, 18 feet, and then what?
Well, you're hiding from the snipers. You're trying to find the sniper so you can shoot back at them. You know, you're not thinking about my knee hurts, my neck hurts, my back hurts. You're not thinking about that. You're thinking about, oh, I could die here if I don't find some cover. You're in an LZ with very little shrubs. There's maybe some undulations in the ground and stuff like that. You're just looking for any way to hide. If you could crawl under your steel helmet, you would. You know, I mean,
wow. And
you're not really thinking so much about anything else other than, you know, they're shooting at me. And so surviving that moment.
So were you alone for a while, or were there other soldiers
down there? No. The helicopter, you know, it was in the descent. Yes, it rocked the helicopter, blew me out the door, but it landed and the other guys got out. Of course, you know, you got a helicopter over here that's burning and exploding, and you've got artillery fire on the perimeters that are supporting the landing. You know, the only way to describe combat like that is just ultimate chaos. No matter what your plan was when you're coming down, the minute you get on the ground, the first shot's fired, throw the plan away, because now it's try to gather yourself and your men and focus on what the threat is to you, and try to suppress the threat. And so all they were trying to do was make the landing as costly for us as possible. They didn't want to stop the landing because they weren't prepared to stop the landing. And so probably by 1:30 or so, everything was secure. The rest of the units were brought in and the helicopters uncontested. Because I was the mortar platoon, I was detailed along with my platoon members while the rest of them were setting the perimeter up. We were not going to be on the perimeter. We were going to be in the middle, and that's where our mortar tubes were going to be set up. And so I was detailed with my platoon to go and pick up the body parts from the helicopters, put them in body bags. And one of the most predominant memories of that, however long that was I came upon this really big guy. He had to be, I don't know, 6'3", 6'4", probably 240, 250. He was blown in half at the torso, right at the belt line. His upper torso was flat, face down. All of the clothing was burned off his back, and his skin looked like a yellow neoprene rubber of some kind. And I had to gather my guys and pick these remains up. We didn't have body bags. We had ponchos.
Yeah.
We'd spread a poncho on the ground, and we'd try to make sure that the parts that we were picking up were from the same body. Wrap them up in a poncho and carry them to what was set up as the helicopter evacuation site for wounded and the like. And I remember that whole day. Now, I'm basically in shock. I'm in shock from the helicopter landing, from being blown out, from the gunfire, from the explosions, and now more traumatized by picking up parts of bodies. And that was the remainder of that day, along with, before nightfall, trying to dig yourself a position, because if we got mortared in the middle of the night, you don't want to be, in an exposed position. And so that night and all the next day, which was Monday, the 19th was a Sunday. So on Monday, we worked on setting up our perimeters and our positions, and we had lost one of our mortar tubes. The next day on Monday, we perfected our positions and, taking survey of your position. We lost a mortar tube. We lost 2 tripods and a base plate in the explosion of the helicopters. So we couldn't actually set our mortars up. So basically, we were we didn't have a mission. We were just kind of gophers, dig your position. And that Monday afternoon, the bigger helicopters, the cargo helicopters, the Chinooks, what we call, brought in all the artillery pieces. And they said, there was 18 artillery pieces in the 277 artillery battalion. We set up our perimeter, and we thought, that the major contest, us being there, was on the landing, and we were not expecting, or I was not expecting. I don't think anybody there was expecting what happened on Tuesday morning.
So I want to get there and talk about that. Just to go back, this horrific experience you had with the body of the soldier who was killed, the big soldier. So what do you do with that? So you say, now evening's coming on and we have to prepare positions and, get all of that together. But you've had this experience. You've got things that are burned into your memory.
Okay.
But over the next several hours, and you don't know, of course, what's coming on Tuesday. You don't know that yet. So, the assumption is, well, the bad stuff is behind us, right?
Yeah, kind of.
What do you do with that as you carry on? Do you just suppress it, let it go, not think about it at all because you have other things to think about?
Oh yeah. There's no way you can't suppress that stuff, and you can't put it out of your mind. It is something you carry with you. And knowing that I've only been in Vietnam now about a little less than 3 months, you got a long ways to go in front of you.
Hmm.
Part of the focus, I think, is always in your mind. I'm here until such and such a time. And I survived today, or I survived yesterday. And hopefully I'm going to survive again today. You have no control. Yeah, the anxiety level in you is almost at the top on a continuum. You don't, it's hard to describe. You're expecting a train wreck every moment of the day.
Hmm.
You have to find a way to live with that without it consuming you. The consuming you of fear of the next moment, of the next day, of the next event. I can't really tell you how I manage that because I don't know. I just know that you're in a position that you can't change.
Hmm.
You're either going to die, be wounded, or you're going to continue on. You have a choice.
The guys you did this with, is it just kind of understood? We're not going to talk about this. Is that just understood, or do you talk about it, or do you all
No,
just?
we never talked about.
Yeah.
We never talked about what just happened. We always will try to find something else to talk about, like, I got a letter from my girlfriend, or my brother did this, or boy, I can't wait to get back to the real world.
Mm.
Be part of sanity again, or whatever. You find, and then it's kind of like morbid humor is another way, humor of any kind, to diffuse the tension.
Just one last question before we get to Tuesday, March 21, 67. I've heard some Vietnam vets say when they have experiences, I'm not going to say similar to the one you just described, but hard experiences. Some say, I just thought that when I got back home, kind of all of this would go away and life would go back to normal, which of course that doesn't happen for the great majority. Others say, I realized that what I was experiencing, what I had just experienced, that had made me a different person. And I didn't know where that would take me, but I knew that. Looking back on yourself, how would you describe your own self? Were you thinking, when I get home, all this is over and it's behind me and that's it? Or was there a realization at the time, there's no way you can shake this stuff off?
That's probably one of the more difficult questions to even think about.
Mm.
There's a long distance between that moment and when you get to leave.
Mm. Mm.
Trying to think about the day you leave while you're 3/4 of the year away from that,
Yeah.
was probably not even in my existence.
Mm.
And I had not yet really had the taste of horror that was going to happen on Tuesday morning.
So very much.
Every experience up to then, getting blown out of the helicopter, picking up the bodies. We had wounded before in firefights. but not to, not to mass casualty levels. One or two guys, maybe not in your platoon, maybe in another platoon. You're not close to, you're close to the ones that are close to you. There are other guys in the company I didn't even know. Because you're in a platoon element, actually even down to a squad element. Where a normal infantry squad, I think, is 11 men. Maybe you're not even that friendly with other people in the squad. You might be just good friends with or close to the fire team that you belong to. There's 2 fire teams in a squad. And so, one of the things that we all fought for, and the realization didn't come at that moment or any time there, but in hindsight, you're fighting for the guy next to you. Mm-hmm. And he's fighting for you. Mm-hmm. And that's the way you kind of develop your attitude. The guy next to you is going to help you stay alive, and you're going to help him stay alive. And it's just that base level.
Yeah.
It doesn't get any, it doesn't get any wider than that so much.
Let me bring you to about 5:30 a.m. on March 21st, 1967.
Yeah. Very strange morning. Oh, that night was strange as well. I remember laying on the ground. You always slept on the ground, Didn't have any kind of sleeping gear besides a poncho liner and a poncho. I remember that night there was a B-52 strike somewhere off in the distance, and the ground kind of almost shook like a minor earthquake. You could hear the noise, but it was way far away, kind of muffled. I woke up really early, or didn't wake up. I probably didn't sleep all night. Mm-hmm. But I remember it was early in the morning, and I was trying to get a cup of coffee. Mm-hmm. So I'm heating up some water, trying to make some coffee. My water wasn't even hot yet. And all of a sudden, mortar rounds start raining in on us. Rockets. You can tell a rocket from a mortar round because there's a projectile with a fizz behind it, almost like a Flash Gordon, space movie of the 50s. The explosions and the chaos that they create instantly change everything. And all you really know from then on is this: what's in front of me. You don't see the whole thing. You don't see the whole battle or anything else. You see what's in front of your face and the threats that are there to you. You can't see a mortar round falling, but you can see the tracer rounds going overhead. Absolute chaos. And it doesn't stop. It's chaos upon chaos upon chaos, stirred up with a lot of steroids. Mm. It does not slow down. Now, I carried 900 rounds of ammunition in 45 loaded magazines. I'm not on the perimeter. I'm in the middle. I'm outside of the perimeter of the artillery pieces. You've got an inner perimeter with the artillery and then an outer perimeter with the infantry. There was enemy in the perimeter when the fighting started. Wow. It was hand-to-hand combat for the most part for that entire morning. I was out of ammunition.
How long did it take you to burn through your ammunition?
I don't know. I can't tell you. Yeah. All I know is that the battle seemed to have gone on for a very long time. And your emotion, your heart's up in your throat, your stomach's up in your throat. Every moment is, am I going to see my own death coming? Or am I going to know when it's happening? And you don't know that. You know, the tracer rounds and the machine gun fire and the almost everybody there has an automatic weapon. The tracer rounds are flowing over your head, probably about belt high. You can't stand up. You can hear them pinging off of the artillery pieces and anything metal. But it's just a continuum of chaos. And I remember, and for me, the battle is not a movie. The battle is a collection of still photographs in my mind. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many enemy soldiers I shot, but every time I pulled the trigger, it was on automatic, and I was burning through ammunition, mainly out of fear and anxiety. Wow. You don't know. I had 6 hand grenades. I only had 2 left.
You said that
I had my bayonet was on my rifle. It was just, I can't really even go beyond describing what the still photographs were. But I remember towards the end of this battle, or we're getting into the later part of the battle, I was real close to one of the artillery pieces. And I remember in all this chaos, this one singular moment where it was almost like the entire world was still and there was no noise. And I heard distinctly a loud command voice hollering at me, "Soldier, get over here." And I turned around looking, and there was this man over by this artillery piece, and he was looking directly at me and, motioning me to get my butt over there. And tracer rounds are flying over your head. And the ammunition piles within our perimeter were exploding. The ammo piles were on fire. So you got your own ammunition blowing up in your perimeter, and you got machine gun rounds overhead. You got rockets flying over your head. Mortar rounds are still falling. And I had to get out of my hole. I had like a little spider hole, just deep enough where I could stand in the bottom and kneel down, and my head was just right at the ground level. And I had to get out of that hole, and I had to crawl about 50 feet over to this artillery piece. That was probably one of the harder things I felt like I had to do that day, was getting out of my hole. Because I had to expose myself in a way to whatever enemy soldier was in our perimeter. I had no ammunition. I had no rounds for my rifle. And I had to crawl over to this artillery piece. Apparently that gun had been damaged by a mortar round or a rocket round or something. Something happened in the breech, lock system. And he had scavenged a part off of another 105. Now, the reason he was using this artillery piece, because it was the closest one to the advancing human wave attacks that were coming. And so he needed help. And I came to find out later, it was Lieutenant Colonel John Vesey and a man named Captain Cartwright, who was the battery commander. There's 3 batteries in our artillery battalion, 6 guns in each battery. And he repaired the gun, and they wanted me to unwrap the ammunition. And so when I got over there, he put me down in between the 2 legs of the 105, and I'm unwrapping the ammunition. And I remember one moment, one of these still photographs in my head, as I looked down the barrel, the side of the 105, and all I could see, there was a lot of smoke and, haze from all the gunfire and explosions and fires. I remember seeing in the distance a mass of humanity coming at us. And the number of machine gun rounds, the tracer rounds, which is overwhelming. And they were all pinging off of the ballistic plates on the 105 and the you know, the leg housings and whatnot. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going to survive this moment. And I don't want to see my death when it comes. So I buried my head into unwrapping these rounds. That was my singular focus. I got to unwrap these rounds. And so how I managed to ignore what was coming and concentrate on unwrapping these rounds, it was because I was so scared that I didn't want to know that I was going to die. And John Vesey and Captain Cartwright fired 4 or 5 of these rounds. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the beehive round. Mm-hmm. Yeah. These were the beehive rounds. We had 30 of them on the site. They'd never been used in combat before. Mm-hmm. This was their very first time. After they fired those rounds, and I'm still sitting behind the gun, you know, I didn't have any more to unwrap, so I'm there and I'm thinking, you know, that I'm not dead yet, but you know, don't carry that thought too far. There was a change in attitude of John Vesey and Captain Cartwright. They all of a sudden were standing, well, they were standing up the whole time. I mean, that's what amazed me about these two guys, is that their singular focus was in firing this artillery piece. They totally ignored, you know, the rounds. Or yeah, they were ducking down behind the gun, but you know, they weren't thinking about the bullets or hiding from the bullets. They were thinking about, how do I get another round in the chamber here and get it fired? And then there was this change of attitude. It was almost an elation, you know, and in that same moment, I could hear the din from a distance of big horsepower machinery, tanks and APCs. And that roar came out of the jungle and then got louder and louder and louder. And Colonel Vesey and this captain, they wandered off from this artillery piece like that. Okay, we're done. You know, and I'm sitting there behind the gun and I'm still thinking, you know, this mass of humanity's coming at us. And I remember standing up and looking out in front of the gun. One of the ugliest sights I've ever seen in my life. Those beehive rounds, boy, they're just destructive. It was like a mass, it was like a butcher shop of a bunch of sloppy butchers. The mass of humanity that was devastated, they ended up pulling bodies off of trees. They were nailed to trees. Inside a beehive round is 8,000 little 1-inch finishing nails with fins. And because of the velocity when they come out of the tube and they explode, you set the fuse in thousandths of a second. And depending on how close the enemy was, well, the enemy was within 20 yards.
Wow.
Maybe a little less. Mm-hmm. It just turned hundreds and hundreds of bodies into ground hamburger. It was the ugliest thing I'd ever seen. And it was shocking. And I have to admit that I was probably in shock from there for probably several weeks. Mm. And all I could remember is that in the noise of the machinery and in the continuation of the gunships and fighter planes and you know, every tank has got, you know, a 50 caliber machine gun besides a big gun. Every APC's got a 50 caliber plus an M60. You know, you probably got, you know, 50 machine guns, you know, firing at maximum rate, along with the machinery at maximum RPM. It was ugly. but it was, at that moment, it was elation. You know, I'm alive.
Mm. Well, that's the word I was going to use in the question I had in my mind. I mean, it sounds very much like, you know, the cavalry coming to the rescue, sort of thing, and these APCs, these tanks, and
Well, I think in reality, the beehive rounds that were fired, all 30 of them,
wow.
probably did a devastating reduction in the enemy force size. That no longer did they have the overwhelming numbers to continue the attack.
Wow.
But you know, I wouldn't want to take away any of the credit from
Sure.
you know the armored cav and the mechanized infantry units that came to our rescue. What you don't see is the chaplain that was. He had a brand new clean uniform on, 2 pearl-handled pistols, shined boots. And if you notice in the picture, everybody's sitting down kind of in a prayer. And
Yeah.
I'm on one knee and I'm kind of staring at his boots, his shined boots. And I'm kind of disturbed at what he's telling us. God's on our side. All these young men died doing God's work. And I'm just, I don't know. If anybody really believes in God, well, God doesn't sanction war, I'm sure. God doesn't sanction inhumanity. Certainly those beehive rounds were a weapon of mass destruction. And certainly those young men who died, I'm sure not one of them would have said to you before they died, I'm going to die doing God's work. I was very disturbed by the whole thing. It was after the firing of the artillery rounds, when Vesey and Cartwright left, when I finally did get up and I walked back to my position, there was another soldier there. And I got him an aid bag, and I didn't have any rounds for my weapon. And we had to go out to the perimeter to see if any of our guys were surviving, and see what we could do to help any of them that were surviving. And as we were kind of slowly moving out, there was still enemy in the perimeter. And I don't know whether it was a Viet Cong or an NBA. You know, you can't distinguish between the two. But there were these mounds. They were actually anthills, and they're really hard, maybe 3 feet tall, and a diameter at the base, maybe 5 feet, 6 feet. One of them came out from behind one of those and charged at us, and I didn't have any rounds. And as he was charging, I thought apparently he didn't have any ammunition either. And you know, whatever happened, whatever the training was, you know, I had been in martial arts and instructing in bayonet training. It wasn't difficult for me to win that case, but that was probably more of a psychological wound. You know, looking somebody in the eyes when you kill them is not something that you want to remember. But it was in our advance. We were probably maybe, I don't know, 30, 40 yards from the perimeter. It was a huge perimeter. The whole perimeter is probably 300 yards long by maybe 100, 150 yards wide. And when you look at the circumference of a circle like that, and then think that there's only 280 infantrymen to fill that perimeter.
Yeah.
And generally 2 men per position.
Mm. You have you've answered this question, indirectly in different ways. But I wanted to come back to something that you said at the outset, and I wrote it down. You referred to the person I was before the battle. How would you describe how these events changed you?
Prior to that, I was a very immature kid,
Mm.
even after 4.5 years in the Army. That's who I was before that battle.
Mm.
I was lost. I didn't know who I was. I had no value for my own life. That battle changed me in a lot of ways. I started to realize that there was a life for me. I just had to make it. I had to figure out what it was supposed to be. And I still had, a considerable amount of time to do in Vietnam and a considerable amount of time to do in the Army.